Dead as Hamlet's dad, but not shot, and the body is still warm. Blore. Looks like his head is caved in.
What is it? I heard a cry.
It's Blore. His head's been smashed in by a marble clock in the shape of a bear.
Oh, but there was one on my... Wait there a moment. It was on my mantle. When Philip escorted me to my room, it must have been already gone. One of you. Philip. Or you.
Wait! That's quite a signal fire. Someone should be able to see it. Dr. Armstrong, dead for hours. And by the looks of him, he's been in the sea most of that time.
Chapter 9. Two little sailor boys sitting in the sun. One got frizzled up, and then there was one.
Don't try to get in. I'm pointing the gun at the door.
I'm not the killer!
You're trying to make me believe Philip is the killer.
Armstrong's dead, his body washed up on the rocks, and Wargrave is sitting in the screening room, dead, again.
That's impossible.
I swear it! This time he was bludgeoned with the law book he wrote. I think that's how he was originally meant to die.
The next rhyme. Two little sailor boys sitting in the sun. One got frizzled up. That means we'll be safe till morning, doesn't it? No one can be frizzled up at night.
No tricks, Narracott, or I'll light you up like Guy Fawkes.
Lombard, listen to me! Blore is dead. Armstrong's dead, so is Wargrave. You're next. You have to be.
That may be your plan, but it won't work.
There's no way Owen can approach you without being seen. Correct?
As we're proving right now.
So it must be some sort of trap. Already set before you came up here.
What sort of trap?
The rhyme. 2 little sailor boys sitting in the sun. One got frizzled up. The only thing approaching the sun on this island right now is that fire. Get away from it.
I like a good explosion as much as the next fellow, but not when I'm the target. I owe you an apology, Narracott, and my thanks for saving my life.
Believe me, I wasn't sure. You out of everyone had been responsible for the most deaths.
Your detecting skills played you false there, old boy. You see, I'm not Philip Lombard. My name is Charles Morley. Got papers to prove it, too. Phil was a friend of mine. He committed suicide a couple of weeks ago. I was at his place when the solicitor Morris rang up. It sounded suspicious. I thought it might have something to do with Phil's death. I wanted to get to the bottom of it, so I came along in his place. Besides, 100 guineas is 100 guineas.
So you're no murderer?
I'll confess I've thought of murdering you more than once the past few days.
Listen, Lombard. Morley. I need to ask you a terrific favor.
You've earned the right.
Can you play dead for a while? Stay out of sight.
Vera must be the killer.
The jury's still out as far as I'm concerned. But if Owen thinks you're out of the way, he may try for me.
Or Vera, if she's innocent.
Which is why I have to get back to the house.
Say, old man, if you want to get into the house without making a racket, the window to my bathroom is open. I used it to get out on the balcony and, make sure Vera was safe.
Uh-huh. Okay, thanks for the tip. Will you lie low? Come running if there's trouble.
It'll be a pleasure to return the favor, old man.
Chapter 10. One little sailor boy left all alone. He went and hanged himself, and then there were none.
I hear a voice. No, voices. They're coming from upstairs.
I don't understand. How can you be here? How could you get into my room so easily?
I've always had a duplicate set of keys, Miss Claythorne, as a former and actually the current owner of this house.
You own this house?
I have for several years. I saw to it that Emily Brent died 2 weeks ago. I took her place for the weekend. My finest performance, I think. Worthy of the Oscar the Academy always refused me.
But the bee stings.
Hurt like hell and did nothing for my complexion. But Emily Brent was allergic, not me. It's my apiary after all.
Who are you?
My name is Gabrielle Steele. You've seen my posters in the screening room.
The actress. Some scandal in Hollywood.
Scandal? Well, I guess if you call trying to kill your leading man a scandal, yes, it was. My final picture, Last of the Borgias, something happened. Lillian Borgia, the character I portrayed. One day on the set, suddenly she was inside my head. She wormed her way in. That's the only way I can think to explain it. Telling me to do things. Showing me how. They called it a breakdown. I now like to think of it as a meeting of two minds.
But why this elaborate plot? Why kill all these people? Why?
Wargrave, of course. He was absolutely right. He was the central character in our little drama.
The Edward Seaton trial?
Yes, Edward Seaton. My love. My life. We met some years ago when I first came to London to star in a play in the West End. Then, after the incident in Hollywood, I came back to England to rest. They wanted me to rest. Edward and I fell in love. I cannot describe to you the depth of our love. You wouldn't understand. I've seen how you flirted with Lombard and Narracott, playing them off against one another.
Did I? I was frightened and confused.
I suppose that's as good an explanation as any. I was never confused. Edward was an innocent man railroaded by that venomous old judge simply to prove a point. That it was his courtroom, his law. 3 days Edward suffered. He couldn't bear the shame or what it would do to me. He killed himself for me. I wanted Wargrave to suffer those 3 days, watching as death approached, powerless to prevent it.
But why the rest of us?
I met Miss Brent at a resort soon after I arrived in England. Hateful old hag. I think I caught her qualities quite nicely. I heard how she had punished Beatrice Taylor for her so-called sin. Drove her to take her own life, just as Wargrave had driven Edward to suicide. I wanted to extend Wargrave's torture for 3 excruciating days. What better way than to make him watch others die? Crimes committed under his very nose. Deaths he was helpless to prevent. How his ego must have been scraped raw.
You researched? Found us all?
Others who had apparently escaped justice, like Miss Brent, with the help of my attorney, Archibald Morris.
How could he agree to help with such a mad plan?
Mad? Madmen kill for no reason, no sense of justice at all. I only killed those who deserved to die. And Morris was a perfect little lawyer, asking no questions as long as the money was good. He'd been responsible for a few miscarriages of justice on his own, so killing him was not a serious moral dilemma. Then the stage was set. We arrived on my island, and the play began. The trickiest part was goading Armstrong into getting so drunk he wouldn't notice the imperceptible pulse that remained after I took the curare. A few bee stings, and then a liberal application of Bellman's universal embrocation to complete the effect. It causes a nasty rash. He saw what he expected to see, a severe allergic reaction that can only result in death.
You killed the judge twice.
Hardly. The first time was some fool scheme he cooked up on his own with Armstrong, so he could pretend to be dead and catch Mr. Owen. I admit stealing Miss Brent's grey yarn and fashioning a wig from it was a nice touch. I was so angry. I couldn't think who had done it or why. I thought braining him with his own law book would be enough to fit the Chancery rhyme.
If you shoot me, you'll be arrested. Patrick will catch you.
I'll deal with Mr. Narracott presently. Then I'll take poison. This ring I wear is a prop from the Borgia movie. Came in very handy this weekend. First for Marston, then Ethel, then my own curare. And now, here we are. Once I'm dead, you can hang yourself and complete the rhyme.
And if I refuse to hang myself?
My dear, what do you think will happen to you if you're the only person found alive on an island with 10 dead bodies? If you don't hang yourself, the law most certainly will.
Patrick! Thank you, Charles.
That's right. If you ever need a break from Narracott, Charles Morley is in the London Directory. Treat her right, Narracott. As far as I'm concerned, you're a better man in a tight spot than Phil ever was. This little sailor boy isn't going near the sea for a long time to come.
Will you listen to me now?
If you insist.
Hugo and Cyril went down to the beach early that day. By the time I arrived, Cyril was out too far. It was too late to reach him. Hugo claimed he had been distracted helping a passerby with directions. I knew how it would look. I thought I loved him. So I told the coroner's inquest that it was I who had been on the beach. Later, when I was cleared, Hugo was jubilant. Yet his feelings for me seemed to have vanished. I realized I had served my purpose. How would it have looked if the boy who stood between him and a fortune died while in his charge? He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. That was the most frightening part. Cyril wanted to swim out to the rocks. All Hugo did was let him.
Mr. Owen invited the wrong guest. It should have been Hugo out there.
No. I should have told the police the truth in the first place. I will now. I have no more right to subvert justice than Mr. Owen. Where is your brother?
Plymouth, turning himself in. Thanks to your and Morley's statements, he's sure to be exonerated.
And us?
Are you still confused?
No. I'm certain now. What about you?
Well, there's another ending to that 10 little sailor boys rhyme. One little sailor boy left all alone. He got married, and then there were none.
Silence, please. I have prepared a special reward for you. The original ending to our little story is somewhat different than the one you have just experienced. If you can complete a final puzzle, childishly simple really, you will be able to learn the original solution to "And Then There Were None," as Dame Agatha Christie first wrote it. Interested? Then your first step is to make your way to the dining room for a final treat.
The last little sailor boy. The film has been spooled.
From my earliest youth, I realized that my nature was a mass of contradictions. I have an incurably romantic imagination, and it was for this reason that I adopted a rather childish and unreliable approach, writing my confession, enclosing it in a bottle, and casting it into the waves. There is 100 to 1 chance that this confession may be found, and then a hitherto unsolved murder mystery will be explained. Another trait born of my contradictory nature is my sadistic delight in causing death. From an early age, I knew very strongly the lust to kill. And yet, I was also indoctrinated with a strong sense of justice. I have always felt that the innocent should be spared and the guilty punished. With this mental makeup, it was inevitable that I would adopt the law as my profession. After ascending to the bench, I found that most of my baser desires were quenched in a legal and just way. And yet of late, I have felt a nagging urge, one that will not free me from its insistent grip. That is the urge to commit a murder myself. I fancied myself an artist in crime, and my imagination waxed secretly to this colossal force. However, I was restrained by my innate sense of justice. The innocent must not suffer. And then, quite suddenly, the solution came to me. I would punish those that the law could not touch. In my years on the bench, there were many cases that frustrated my will, cases wherein I knew the accused to be guilty, and yet the evidence was such that he could never be convicted. Cases of deliberate murder that were quite untouchable within the confines of the law. So I determined to commit not just one murder, but murder on a grand scale. A childish rhyme of my infancy came back to me. The rhyme of the 10 little sailor boys. Something about it fascinated me. The inexorable diminishment, the sense of inevitability. And so I began, secretly, to collect victims. I will not go into detail about how this was accomplished. Suffice to say, I was convinced of the guilt of every one of my victims, and I knew enough about them via my connections to be able to lure each one to Shipwreck Island with an appropriate bait. And now to the mechanics of the actual crime. In what I took as a sign, none of my plans misfired, and all of my guests arrived at Shipwreck Island on the 8th of August. The party included myself. The order of the deaths were dictated by what I viewed as my victims' varying degrees of guilt. Those whose guilt was lightest should go first, and not suffer the increasing mental strain and fear reserved for the more cold-blooded offenders. The first death had already occurred. Archibald Morris, a shady little dope peddler, had set up the details for me, renting the island, sending the letters, and recording the gramophone record before I ended his life with a dose of potassium cyanide. Anthony Marsden and Mrs. Rogers died next, one instantaneously, the other in a peaceful sleep. Marsden's crime was one of circumstance and his amoral nature. Mrs. Rogers, I had no doubt, acted largely under the influence of her husband. Their murders were the easiest. Poison, easily slipped into a glass for each of them, as at this point, no one had any reason to be suspicious. General Mackenzie met his death quite painlessly and never heard me approach. I am convinced that he was dead long before he ever came to Shipwreck Island. At this point, I found it necessary to recruit an ally. Dr. Armstrong seemed the most suited to this task, as it was inconceivable to him that a man of my standing could be a murderer. He was taken in with no resistance. I killed Rogers on the morning of the 10th. He, too, did not hear me approach. During the chaos arising from finding his body, I slipped into Lombard's room and abstracted his revolver. At breakfast, I slipped my last dose of poison into Miss Brent's coffee. It was enough to render her unconscious, and I returned a short time later to inject a strong dose of cyanide into her. It was just after this that I intimated to Armstrong that we must carry our plan into effect, that I must appear to be the next victim. This would, perhaps, rattle the murderer, and at any rate would allow me to move about the house and spy on whom I wished. A gunshot and some red mud on the forehead was all it took. After all, it was only Armstrong who examined me closely. After returning the revolver to Lombard's room, I had a rendezvous set up with Armstrong on the edge of a cliff. He was still quite unsuspicious, although he ought to have been warned by the nursery rhyme, "A red herring swallowed one." Once at the cliff, I uttered an exclamation, leaned over the cliff. Wasn't that the mouth of a cave? He leaned right over. A swift push sent him quickly into the heaving sea below. He took the red herring, all right. And now came the moment I had anticipated. 3 people who were so frightened of each other that anything might happen. And one of them had a revolver. I watched them from the windows of the house. When Blore came up alone, I had the big marble clock poised ready. Exit, Blore. From my window, I saw Vera shoot Lombard. I always thought she was a match for him and more. I then immediately set the stage in her bedroom. It was an interesting experiment. Would the knowledge of her own guilt, the hypnotic suggestion of her surroundings, and the nervous tension of having just shot a man be enough to coerce her into taking her own life? It was. Vera Claythorne hanged herself before my very eyes as I stood in the shadow of the wardrobe. And now I shall finish writing this. I shall enclose it and seal it in a bottle and throw the bottle into the sea. Why? Yes. Why? I suppose I have a pitiful human wish that someone should know just how clever I have been. I must go now and finish this. It is essential that my body be found in accordance with the record kept by my fellow victims. My own life is of no consequence. My doctors tell me I have a month to live at most. I do not wish to die the death of the invalid patient, steeped to the gills in drugs, culminating in a complete loss of human dignity. I will instead be found laid neatly in my bed, shot through the forehead. When the sea goes down, there will come from the mainland boats and men, and they will find 10 dead bodies and an unsolved problem on Shipwreck Island. Signed, Lawrence Wargrave.